asynchronous learning in Navigate Math. Students spend the first 2 units of Navigate Math building skills essential to successful blended learning and student-centered learning experiences. Examples of these skills include note-taking, work evidence, organization, time management, collaboration, and reflection and goal setting. Equipped with these skills, students may start Unit 3 at their own pace, exercising choice over learning experiences, assessments, and homework. The purpose of this screencast is to show what this learning model looks like for a student as they progress through a typical learning objective. Let's start by taking our example student, Taylor Swift, and locating where she left off. By pressing the Locate Me button, the student can save valuable seconds, not having to hunt around where they were last working. Scrolling down, we can see her last position was on composite numbers. She had just finished a quiz on prime numbers and was ready to start the learning collection on the next topic, composite numbers. An important point to make regarding Navigate Math and students moving at their own pace has to do with what they're expected to do. Students are expected to work through every lesson in a unit. Where their choice comes in involves the learning experiences, assessments, and homeworks within each lesson. To fully understand why our student is here and perhaps even skipped an assessment, we need to start at the beginning and look at the unit Diagnostic. We'll end by returning to this sample lesson and going through the process on this learning objective with her. At the start of a unit, students take a diagnostic. The diagnostic is extremely similar to the summative exam at the end of a unit. It is more computational in essence, looking at the foundational pieces necessary for this unit on fraction types for students to be successful. More rigorous tasks, in the form of writing tasks, apply throughout the unit to push student understanding with these basic topics. After a student finishes the diagnostic, it's graded, and they will start by doing a reflection and an analysis. Students will go through a reflection identifying how they did by each topic in the unit. Circling the problems they get wrong, they're able to build a profile of their baseline understanding. They then move on to list topics of strength and also areas for them to grow. They set goals and next steps so they can maximize their effort to work on their growth areas most and build off their strengths. After going through the reflection process, students can make a copy, or teachers can print out, what we call a diagnostic to-do list. Grayed out areas are tasks, and while these are the lessons and these are the assessment tasks, these grayed out areas are tasks that students are expected to do no matter what. They could be demonstrating work habits such as work evidence or how to take notes that are non-negotiable. However, there are lower rigor computational assessments that students can essentially test out of if they demonstrate proficiency based on commonly mapped questions from the diagnostic. So if, for example, our student Taylor Swift demonstrated from the diagnostic enough proficiency at a computational level for something in composite and prime numbers, she could mark it as complete on her own individual organizer, creating her own pathway to avoid what could be busy work to focus on higher rigor applications. Each student can create their own version of this to-do list. Going back to Lesson 4, it could be perhaps that Taylor demonstrated she didn't need to work on prime numbers in a basic fashion. In this case, this happened to be a Khan Academy mission, working on a computation level, identifying what prime numbers happen to be. That can save her time and allow her to move at a more appropriate pace to work on higher rigor tasks. Our student, fresh off of demonstrating adequate mastery of prime numbers, and most likely having tested out based on her diagnostic of having to do a lower level computation task on prime numbers, is ready for composite numbers. Her day might start by organizing herself, looking at her data, and then starting in on composite numbers as the learning experience goes. It's important to note that the learning expectations for a student are flipped. When they begin moving at their own pace, students are expected to first use the skills they developed over the first 2 units to look at a set of learning experiences themselves. If they find they're struggling, their next step is to speak to a peer in their group. The final step is to approach the teacher. This is intentional. Students are expected to work with the learning resource themselves first because that allows students to move at their own pace and better meet their individual needs, instead of starting with the teacher directing the learning. Additionally, this is how learning in high school, and most particularly in college, occurs. Students are expected to engage with the material first, then speak with peers second, and finally approach their teacher for clarification last. Of note, though, this does not mean the teacher is not providing instruction. We'll speak later to how teachers will shift from direct instruction to responsive instruction, looking at student data and planning specific mini-lessons targeted at small groups and individuals based on that data. Teaching does not disappear, it simply shifts in form to be more responsive. Going back to the student learning experience, the student here is being told by the teacher they're expected to review the factors resource first, that is required, before choosing at least one of the following 3 resources to take notes on according to their learning preference. The general expectation is that students take notes on at least 1 resource per learning collection, and that evidence of notes is checked at multiple times throughout the unit. So the student will decide which resources to work on. Perhaps is the reading, it could be the video, it could be an interactive. It depends on their learning preference. Following their experience, they would have notes, and those would live as an artifact somewhere that the teacher can check at any time, generally a notebook or in a binder. Once students have completed their responsibility with respect to the learning process, if they needed clarification, they asked a peer or asked the teacher. Moving forward, they would then go and work on the assessments that followed. Perhaps it's a linked out mission such as Khan Academy, or it may be that they did not need to do that and they tested out of it based on their diagnostic, and they may go into a higher rigor task or a system built quiz that the teacher wants real-time data on. We can see that it looks like our student looked ahead and tried the quiz on composite numbers but didn't fare very well. So, not doing well, the next step for the student would be to go back to the resources first to try and remediate. If they were stuck, you'll notice a key aspect of the Learning Navigator is to see where the student's peers happen to be. Our student has 6 peers in the class on the exact same topic. This allows the student to go to the second step for help seeking and learning, which is to speak to their peers. If, after that, they're still stuck, they can seek out their teacher. If the teacher, looking at the real-time data, hasn't already sought out the student or groups of students with similar misunderstandings already. After going through the learning experience or revisiting the learning experience after an unsuccessful attempt on an assessment, the student will take the assessment and generate new data. Looking quickly at this assessment and to generate some data, how many factors does the number 10 have? Factors does 13 have? Select all composite numbers. Again, select all composite numbers. Let's get this one wrong. Let's say this is composite when it's really prime. And finally, the smallest composite number is 4. The student gets their results, and they can look by standard or microstandard to see how they did and where they need to work on the most, so they can target the remediation. They can also work backwards from correct answers to try and match their answers to the key and recreate and correct whatever misunderstanding they may have. They're also able to look back over multiple attempts to see how they did, to see growth, and also for their teacher to hold them accountable. When students finish an assessment, they are brought to their Data tab. On this view, they're able to look over their entire course to see how they're doing. They can drill down through a unit, all the way down into a lesson, to see how many different assessments they've submitted, and also how they're doing on average. They can view the various reports that we just looked at, and also redo assessments, see total time and number of attempts. When students are making decisions on what to do next, often they simply move on to the very next assessment in their course map. However, this view allows them to look across an entire lesson, unit, or course to identify other areas that may need attention. For example, looking back at Unit 1, that perhaps a quiz that may exist in this lesson is something the student may want to go back and revisit, particularly if the topic was influencing something they were currently working on in a later unit. Students at the end of a lesson will set their own homework. Since everyone's in a different spot, they need to decide what their individual homework happens to be. Doing so is usually involves doing one of two things. Students will either set the next assessment that they have to do for homework, or they'll look back over their data and identify a prior assessment that could use some attention. Either way, homework is almost always an assessment that they're expected to complete. The next day when they come in, they're expected to have an artifact on paper as proof of what they did. It can get a little complicated managing that as a teacher, and that is something that will be discussed in a different screencast. However, if we were this student, we may either identify a past assessment, or perhaps we're ready to move on, and we're going to move into prime factorization. Our homework would therefore be this prime factorization assessment. Assessments, being homework, include any learning experiences associated with them. So if our students set prime factorization in Lesson 5 and Unit 3 as their homework, it is expected they would also produce notes from the learning experience associated with it. The following day, the teacher would check this student's individual assessment to make sure they did it. A management technique for that can be as simple as creating a shared Google Doc with the class. In this Google Sheet, you have the students listed versus whatever activity they may be doing. While this is slightly modified, the idea is essentially the same. Students versus whatever they themselves type in according to teacher expectations that they will do that night. And then the teacher often will lock the tab down below so students cannot later change it, and then the next day use it to check individually if students did their homework. A common technique is for teachers to stamp or mark the student's work artifact in some fashion so it can't be resubmitted later. Students will occasionally try to do this. Sometimes teachers will have a student at each individual group check the group's homework against this shared doc to do so in a more efficient fashion. More on these types of management techniques later. In summary, students moving asynchronously, working at their own pace, start the unit with a diagnostic to identify which assessments, if any, they can test out of, and then proceed to work through a learning experience and take notes on it, which is often what happens within a class, follow up with practices on these assessments, Both notes from the learning experience and work evidence from the assessments live in a binder or a notebook and can be referenced at any time by the student or teacher. And for homework, students always set the next assessment as their homework, or if looking at their data, they can identify a past assessment worth assigning for homework. The general expectation is for students to complete one assessment per class and one for homework. However, that can vary based on a daily type of class versus a block schedule, not meeting every day, and also tasks are not created equal. Khan Academy type practice missions versus quizzes internally versus more rigorous writing tasks can take up varying degrees of time, so it tends to be a rough guide. Note, the key to managing self-paced learning for the students is to ensure that their work evidence and notes live in a very specific place. Students will be expected in every unit across the course to be accountable for how they take notes, how they show their work evidence, and how they organize themselves. So for example, at the 50% mark and 100% mark of every single unit, students will have to conduct an audit of their notes and work evidence. Throughout the entire unit, they have to demonstrate they have the appropriate evidence for every assessment and that they took notes. They do so assessing themselves against a rubric first, then go through the process of having a peer do so before turning it into a teacher. This ensures accountability and helps reinforce organization throughout the course. An essential component not discussed in this screencast includes weekly goal setting and reflection, a process necessary for students to manage their time and move at an effective pace based on their needs and current capacity. That will be covered in a different screencast, as will how teachers manage and use data to be responsive in their instruction with students moving at their own pace.